Hey guys, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of the unofficial Final Fantasy VII Novelisation, the standalone novel The Nibelheim Incident, which is now an audio series also produced by KupoCon, and the forthcoming book Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. Like my videos covering Chapter 8 of the game, my breakdown of Chapter 9 will require multiple entries. In this episode, I'll be examining the opening part of the chapter, itself titled The Town That Never Sleeps. That said, the scenario at Aerith's house is technically the tail end of Chapter 8, but I feel it fits better here. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 9 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, as always, if you're not familiar with the original story, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. Having promised Elmira he would steal away from the Gainsborough residence in the middle of the night, Cloud lies in bed dreaming of his mother. Just as in the original game, we are introduced to her in a memory of their home in Nibelheim, during what is later revealed to be the fateful mission Cloud was sent on with Sephiroth. The dialogue here closely follows the old version, where his mother talks about the temptations of Midgar, and how he should settle down with an older girl. It's perhaps coincidence, but the timing of this particular recollection is curious in respect to our hero's romantic feelings. The love triangle between Cloud, Tifa and Aerith has been an infamous point of contention among Final Fantasy VII fans, but it's worth noting that Aerith is older than Cloud, while Tifa is younger. Therefore, dreaming of this scene might not just be about his mother, it may be him processing his feelings towards the flower girl. The way Cloud is dressed in this flashback is another interesting factor. He is obviously garbed in the Soldier First Class uniform, but his shoulder pauldrons are standard issue, rather than the single spiked variant he uses in the present day. This is exactly how Zack wore his during Crisis Core, which is a little nod to future revelations. The biggest thing to come out of this memory, however, is that the name of Cloud's mother has finally been verified in-game. It has never been a secret that early character designs by Tetsuya Nomura for the original Final Fantasy VII identified her as Claudia Strauss, aged 33. Nomura has confirmed in interviews that Claudia has always been the development team's name for her. It just never appeared anywhere in the compilation. Having said that, other than this scene in the old game, she only shows up once more. That's in Nibelheim's town square during Crisis Core. When Cloud attempts to sneak out of the bedroom, he finds an obstacle course of cleaning equipment and furniture waiting for him. The object here is to slowly creep around the items so that Aerith doesn't hear you, which is a callback to the original game when the player has to walk very slowly to avoid the creaking floorboards. If Aerith catches you, she forces Cloud back into the bedroom, insisting that she will take him straight to Sector 7 in the morning. Doing this multiple times will prompt increasingly assertive dialogue from the girl, going as far as calling Cloud a jerk. And after you mess up a second time, some of the obstacles magically vanish, as if they've been tidied away. It's not possible to see here, but in the original game, the bird's eye view of the bedrooms shows Aerith is awake the entire time. I've spoken on several occasions in this series about all the little details the developers have included which just bolster the player's experience of this dystopian environment. Another brief example of this is when you look at the underside of the plate during the night. You can clearly see sun lamps illuminating the slums from above Sector 7 and from the inner districts of the plate to the south. You might note, however, that the lamps adjacent to Mako Reactor 5 have been dulled. Of course, these were the ones Cloud, Tifa and Barrett had to deactivate during Chapter 6. As Cloud approaches the tunnel between Sectors 5 and 6, Aerith pokes her head out from behind a column of debris. This visual is pretty important, and I'll come back to it in a minute. Like in the original game, the girl has somehow managed to slip out of her own bedroom and get ahead of Cloud, having suspected his plan all along. In the end, he doesn't put up much of a fight and agrees to let Aerith lead him to Sector 7. When she walks off down the passage, however, Cloud has one of his mental jolts. The sight has triggered another vision in his mind, but in this occasion, the player isn't shown what he sees. What we are afforded is a glimpse of Cloud shedding a tear, in a rare expression of emotion. Aerith immediately picks up on this, and he does his best to conceal his face until he has regained his composure. The implications of this scene are enormous in the context of the remake, and while much of what I'm about to discuss is based on evidence within the compilation, it does fall into the category of speculation. First of all, I highlighted the manner in which Aerith initially emerges here, and how she eventually wanders off up the passage. This is a deliberate allusion to a dream Cloud has in the original game, following the events at the Temple of the Ancients. The dream is set in the sleeping forest north of Bone Village, where Aerith first announces her presence by poking her head out from behind a tree, in exactly the same way she does in the remake. She communicates with Cloud's subconscious, revealing that she intends to protect the planet from Sephiroth, as only a Cetra can. Before running off, Aerith tells him that she will return once the fight to prevent Meteor is over. Cloud, on the other hand, cannot move, try as he might, and is helpless as he watches Sephiroth descend and vow to stop the girl. I spoke in the first part of my Chapter 8 video trilogy about Cloud having a vision of the future when Aerith references her white materia. The premonition was of the orb bouncing from the altar at the Forgotten Capital, meaning we already have a precedent in the remake for what Cloud has seen of that iconic sequence. In the tunnel between Sectors 5 and 6, he experiences a sort of reverse déjà vu, where a flood of emotion has overcome him. This is because, in the blink of an eye, he has envisioned his exchange with Aerith in the sleeping forest and understood the consequences of Sephiroth's vow. This is presumably what has caused Cloud to cry. But that is just the first layer, and we need to dig much deeper to fully comprehend the impact of this scene. As many of you probably noticed, the music playing while Cloud is having his jarring recollection is the melodic notes of Final Fantasy VII's opening theme. So, what's important about that? Well, the track appears in the respective introductions to 3 of the compilation's titles. In the original game, with Aerith in the alleyway. In Advent Children, with Red 13 and his cubs overlooking Midgar. And in Crisis Core, with Zack leaping onto the moving train. The music is further used in Crisis Core's epilogue, the PlayStation 3 tech demo demonstrated by Sony in 2005, and in one more place, the last climactic moments of Final Fantasy VII. And this is where things get really interesting. It's never been a secret, but neither has it been common knowledge, that the visuals of Aerith's face immersed in particles of spirit energy, as seen in the original's opening and climax respectively, don't actually match. In the opening, when the starry sky transitions into the green discharge of a leaking Mako pipe, Aerith's eyes are open. At the climax, however, when Meteor's destruction transitions to spirit energy, Aerith's eyes are closed, and she then gazes up. The purpose of the latter image was likely to create a poignant reminder for the player of how far they had come, but also to verify that the livestream bursting from the surface to save the planet was Aerith's doing. Bear in mind that prior to the release of the Final Fantasy VII Ultimani Omega in 2005, it was not clear to Western gamers in particular what the extent of her actions were after her death. The sequence of Aerith inspecting the Mako pipe in the lane behind Loveless Theatre, then wandering onto the Sector 8 street, has been presented 4 separate times. Unlike the original game, neither the epilogue of Crisis Core nor the PlayStation 3 tech demo show Aerith's eyes, and instead use a surge of livestream strands to transition to a side shot of her face. I'll come back to the importance of this specific observation later in the series. For now though, I'm going to point out that in the Remake's intro movie, the camera pans down into the alley while Aerith kneels by the pipe, eyes closed as if in prayer. Only after she has opened her eyes and continued with her, let's say, interaction, is she spooked by something. Therefore, it could be suggested that the remake's opening matches the original game's climax, not its beginning. And what does that mean? I've mentioned already in this video series that there are several occasions when Aerith comments on things she shouldn't have knowledge of. In the tunnel scene at the start of Chapter 9, Cloud has another vision of something that has not yet come to pass. So, is he seeing the future? Or is he experiencing the memories of someone who has already lived through them? The key to unlocking that question may indeed be the opening theme music that accompanies his emotional response, as its unique use in the original Final Fantasy VII implies the remake is something of a sequel. There's also the particular message Aerith offers Cloud during his dream of the sleeping forest, in that she will come back after Meteor is stopped. Those of you who have completed the remake may already recognise the wider connotations of this concept. That said, I don't wish to conjecture any more on the topic at this time to avoid unnecessary spoilers, but rest assured I will revisit it in later episodes. As Cloud and Aerith proceed along the Sector 6 trail, the ex-soldier remarks on how clearly he can see the sky from here. Aerith responds that the plate above is still being constructed, and that she doesn't like this part of Midgar, which is a callback to an earlier conversation where she admits to preferring the steel sky. She goes on to reference the collapse of the Sector 6 plate long ago, which I touched on in the last episode, and provides some more detail. The accident apparently occurred shortly after people began moving there, so the loss of life was relatively minimal. I really enjoyed this little backstory, especially in conjunction with some of the comments made by the elders at the Sector 5 Community Centre. However, it's fairly inconsistent with previous compilation lore. In fact, there's almost no clarity on this subject at all. The corresponding section of the original game was a single field, the collapsed expressway. No explanation is given for the wreckage, but we know it's far from random. When the player later reaches the 65th floor of Shinra headquarters, there is a small minigame where they must collect parts to complete a scale model of Midgar's plate. There's a gaping hole on the model where Sector 6 should be, indicating that the writers had considered some kind of backstory. Furthermore, if you watch the opening movie of the old Final Fantasy VII, or any cutscene where the Sector 6 plate appears for that matter, you can clearly see it is incomplete. There are some additional pieces of information that crop up elsewhere in the compilation. The 10th anniversary Ultimania includes an official timeline of events, noting that work on the plate started in Mu Era 1976, while the opening of Crisis Core, itself set in Year Zero of the New Era 24 years later, shows construction continuing on the plate and Shinra headquarters alike. During that game, Zack receives a company-wide email from Director Reeve, which estimates Sector 4 will be the last of the upper city to be finished. This obviously contradicts the state of Sector 6 at the time of the New Era, Year 7, when the original Final Fantasy VII is set. One possible explanation for this may be found in the climax of Before Crisis, where the summoning of the apocalyptic Zirconiad between episodes 22 and 23 causes the surrounding area of Midgar, specifically Sectors 6 and 7, to shake, and this occurs a few months before Final Fantasy VII. That said, the material damage to the city is never quantified, and the Turks are able to defeat the monster before it can wreak havoc on the physical world. In the remake, however, the collapse of Sector 6 is implied to have happened years, if not decades ago. This retcons the Compilations editions because there's no way Sector 6 will be completed before Sector 4, and the district was destroyed long before Zirconiad was summoned. Further along the trail, Cloud and Aerith come to a crest where there's a view of Wall Market in the distance. I'll discuss the town in a lot more detail in the next episode, but there are a few nuggets of lore that have been introduced here for the first time. Aerith's description of the district is reminiscent of real-world prospector towns of America or Australia during the gold rushes, with bars and brothels aplenty. She goes on to say that the lawless quarter became more than the government were willing to handle, and they simply built a wall around the area to keep it contained. What's interesting here is Aerith's use of the word government, because that doesn't reflect the Shinra Corporation's monopolistic rule over Midgar. It's important to remember, however, as Jessie tells Cloud in the original Final Fantasy VII, Midgar was made up of individual towns prior to the plate's construction. A regional government would thus have been in existence during that era, and there is at least one remnant of it that we encounter later in the remake. That is, of course, Mayor Domino. It's also worth pointing out that before her description of Wall Market begins, Aerith presumes Cloud is familiar with the town. He tells her that he enlisted straight after he left Nibelheim, somewhere around his 15th birthday according to the official timelines, and was never properly acquainted with the slums. Aerith's presumption makes perfect sense, given how much time Zack spends down here during Crisis Core, both in her company and on various assignments through the game's Sojourn missions. Having said that, there is a small element of contradiction in Cloud's words. As I discussed in my Chapter 5 video of this series, Cloud shows up as an infantryman during Episode 5 of Before Crisis, escorting a Shinra scientist from one of the slum train stations. While there's no evidence to suggest he should be more familiar with the Undercity than that, the line may be a vague hint at Cloud's amnesia. As with many environments in the remake, the collapsed expressway of Sector 6 is hugely expanded from the single field in the old game. It has, however, retained a few little details from that location. The most obvious of these is the giant robotic hand, which developers even managed to turn into a trio of puzzles for the player. And it isn't just the environment that has been expanded. The remake has included some minor characters in the shape of Beck, Burke and Butch, aka Beck's Badasses. The concept for the threesome seems to have evolved principally from one of the enemies that can be faced during the original on the neighbouring roads of Sector 5, known as Vice. In the old game, Vice combatants shared the same battle models as bandits and prowlers, and an enhanced version, also called bandits, appear in the remake as generic members of Beck's Badasses. Like their predecessors, the characters do actually steal from Cloud and Aerith during the subsequent skirmish. As a couple of side observations, the symbol on the masks worn by the thieves has suspicious similarities to the Xanark and Abe's emblem from Final Fantasy X, closely associated with Tidus and Jecht. Additionally, this isn't the first time the name Butch has been seen in the compilation. The owner of one of the stalls outside the Costa del Sol Inn in the old game is called Butch as well. Soon after entering the tunnels, Cloud and Aerith are attacked by a sweeper prototype that smashes through the rubble. With the exception of the smoggers of the Sector 5 scrapyard and undeveloped land behind Centre District, this is the first time we encounter a Shinra weapon in the slums. And there's a good reason for this, as I touched on in an earlier episode. Accessing the enemy intel screen for the sweeper prototype, its profile notes that early weapons with malfunctioning AI were discarded to the slums, but remained operational. This is another callback to Crisis Core, when Zack is sent on numerous missions to destroy or deactivate machines that were going haywire, after they were deployed down here to tackle the monster infestations. The descriptions of those special assignments state that some of the weapons' programming finds it difficult to distinguish between monsters and soldier members, while in other cases, Genesis copies have uploaded viruses into the test models. It's extremely likely this particular sweeper falls into one of these categories. Speaking of soldier members, as the player navigates the collapsed expressway, Aerith eventually asks Cloud why he quit. He dodges the question, so she probes about whether he had any soldier friends or war buddies. The latter reference here is a callback to how Cloud describes Sephiroth in the original game, when he begins his retelling of the Nibelheim incident at the Calm Inn. Aerith's line of questioning, though, is clearly her way of testing the waters on whether or not to broach the subject of her ex-boyfriend Zack. It also parallels a string of messages Zack receives from Tifa on his portable terminal during the Nibelheim scenario in Crisis Core. In these, the girl asks if he knows a blonde soldier, an obvious allusion to Cloud, but insists that he keeps her inquiries a secret. Regardless of the circumstances and his complex psychological issues, I still found it quite sad that Cloud denounces his friendship with Zack in this scene. The pair emerge from the tunnels at Evergreen Park, the name of the area in the remake, retconned from Green Park as it was earlier in the compilation. Like in the original, Cloud and Aerith find the gateway to Sector 7 closed, and the flower girl kills some time by inviting him to join her on top of the Moogle slide. She tells him that she used to sell flowers here a long time ago, which is yet another reference to Crisis Core. In Chapter 8 of that game, once the player had collected all the parts to build Aerith a flower cart, she and Zack trial the wagon right here. It is the inauguration of Operation Midgar Full of Flowers, Wallet Full of Money, and depending on the player's choices, they do attract a variety of customers. The conversation then aligns with the old games, with the subject turning to which rank of soldier Cloud was. Aerith comments on how weird it is that he is the same class as the first guy she ever loved. Anyone who has ever read Benny Matsuyama's novella, loosely translated as The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, from the Final Fantasy VII Ultimani Omega, may note how significant a contradiction this line is, because his interpretation of the relationship between Zack and Aerith is that it was platonic. I would add though that the novella predates Crisis Core and is not technically canon. Anyway, when Cloud asks Aerith to name her previous boyfriend, we see that she does speak it aloud, but he has another mental jolt which prevents it being heard by either him or the player. This differs from the original because Aerith elects not to share the name during the corresponding scene, for reasons best known to herself. When he recalibrates his thoughts, Cloud finds the girl staring into his eyes. This mirrors the visual from Crisis Core when Aerith and Zack's gazes lock, the first time they visit Green Park together. The callback is not lost on Aerith, who remarks that she is familiar with the Mako glow borne by soldiers, and her reaction suggests it is still a sore subject for her. I spoke in my first episode covering Chapter 8 of the remake that Aerith was historically afraid of the real sky, and is comforted by having the plate above her. The scene in Crisis Core to which I'm referring is the first instance where that fear is taken away, because she can see the colour of the sky in Zack's eyes. On a few occasions during the early part of Chapter 9, Aerith reaffirms how she was acquainted with Sector 6 as a kid, especially in the context of the route to Evergreen Park. But we already knew that from the original game and Crisis Core. What is a new addition though, is her knowledge of a secret passage below the Sector 7 gate, the entrance of which is located beneath another giant Moogle frame. Speculative as this is, it may provide an explanation as to why Aerith isn't as oblivious to the goings-on in the Sector 7 slums as we previously assumed. Either way, this spot becomes important later in the remake. As Cloud prepares to say goodbye to Aerith, the hulking gate opens and a chocobo-drawn cart trundles through, just as it does in the old version. They realise Tifa is the girl in the back, so Cloud chases the cart and climbs on its rear. She is wearing a beautiful dress and reveals she is on her way to see Don Corneo, promising to explain everything in due course. What may not have been obvious to newer players is that Tifa's outfit is dependent on earlier choices they made. If Cloud completes all the side quests during Chapter 3, a bonus scene becomes available where Tifa invites her childhood friend into her bedroom at Stargazer Heights. They discuss celebrating their reunion by having a night out, and the player can suggest what Tifa should wear. The options are something mature, something sporty, or something exotic. The mature dress is simply a reimagining of her outfit in the original, and is the default if the player does not complete the bonus scene in Chapter 3. As for both the exotic and sporty options, their designs are heavily influenced by Far Eastern styles. The exotic dress, for example, is similar to a Japanese kimono. What's interesting here is that it's no secret to the people of the slums that Don Corneo is obsessed with the culture of Wutai, and, as I've mentioned in previous videos, Wutai itself is equated with the real world's Far East. From this alone, we can infer that Tifa is deliberately trying to capture the Don's attention. It's maybe also worth mentioning that Tifa's sporty dress and accompanying hairstyle bear a significant resemblance to Chun-Li of the Street Fighter franchise. Chun-Li is arguably the most iconic female martial artist in video game history, and hails from China. Curiously, the character's backstory is that she seeks vengeance after her father was killed by Street Fighter's primary antagonist, M. Bison. This reflects Tifa, whose own father was murdered by Sephiroth at the Mount Nebel reactor, as I spoke about in episode 7, and she thereafter vowed to use her martial art abilities to battle Shinra. And finally, while we're on the subject of Tifa's story, Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura, the game's producer and director respectively, shared details in an interview found in the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania of some additional content the team had initially hoped to include. One such example is, somewhere between chapters 7 and 9, they had intended to have a scenario about Tifa and Marl, the elderly landlady of Stargazer Heights, who is, of course, an Avalanche sympathiser. Marl would supposedly help Tifa pick out a dress to infiltrate Don Corneo's mansion, and there was a narrative behind how she arranged the chocobo carriage. It's unclear what the specifics of this content might have been, before it was cut because of time restraints, but it does verify that the creators put a lot of thought into the outfits. If you look closely, you can still see a little homage to the chapter that never was. Back in episode 3 of this series, I highlighted that the reward for completing the bonus scene was the Crescent Moon Charm, an earring said to be imbued with the fervent desire to be by one's side for eternity. It is Marl herself who gifts this to Cloud, and the very same accessories are worn by Tifa in this chapter, if she selects the mature dress. There's even the possibility that a bit more information was due to be shared in that segment about the girl's past, because the art book that accompanies the deluxe editions of the remake has a new illustration by Nomura himself of Tifa's famous martial arts instructor. Master Zangan does not appear anywhere in the released version of the game, so his presence in the art book is open to speculation. The same interview in the Ultimania also reveals Kitase's intention to have a sub-scenario concerning the Turks at some point, while Nomura confirmed other plots had been written for characters from elsewhere in the compilation. This likely references Kyrie and Leslie from the official novella The Kids Are Alright, the latter of whom we will meet very soon. Well everyone, this has been part 1 of my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from Chapter 9 in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, creator videos, etc. And be sure to look out for my new book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which releases on October 13th. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, in association with KupoCon, and I'll speak to you again soon.